All right, what's going on, guys? Excuse me. In my last video, I covered my theory that the Erdtree was born out of Marika removing the order, or persona, from the Erdtree and grafting what remained to the roots of a sealing tree. This shadow of the Erdtree, as in the shadow coined by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, is the primordial crucible that was previously restrained, and it's what became known as the Shadow Tree. Well, let's continue pulling this thread, for there's a far deeper mystery that's been right out in the open ever since the game's original release. A mystery that was greatly expanded upon in the DLC, but still left without any definitive answers. What even is the Crucible? For this video, I will truly be standing on the shoulders of giants. I don't fully agree with a single take that I have seen, but their research has been instrumental in the formulation of my own theory. This is part 2 of my series, which focuses on the divine trees, so if you have not, I highly recommend you watch part 1 first and come back, as I'll be referencing that video a fair amount. Feel free to like and subscribe, and now let me walk you through this journey and discover what the nature of the Crucible really is. The definition of a crucible in real life is a container in which metals or other substances are subjected to high heat. A more metaphorical definition would be something like a trial, tribulation, or transformative experience which leads to growth or development. But in Elden Ring, the Crucible refers to the aforementioned Crucible of Life, or the Primordial Crucible, an ambiguous force from which the Erdtree was derived. In the current age, aspects of the Crucible usually manifest as appendages that appear on animals: tails, wings, frog tongues, and most prominently, horns, just to name a few. The descriptions of the Crucible talisman state that these aspects grew on the human body long ago, and they still do sometimes in the case of the Omen, Misbegotten, and the Horn Scent. Outliers include the blooms found on the Miranda flowers and thorns. A new item from the DLC, the Talisman of All Crucibles, is an intermingling mass of crucible attributes, and it's said to have sprouted on the bodies of giants, called the Mother of All Crucibles in ancient tower lore. Horns in particular have an affinity for drawing in and containing spirituality. This is a central aspect of the Horn-Scent religion, the focus of their beliefs being a normalized crucible current known as the Spiral, which will one day form a column that stretches to the gods. This term, normalized, is important. It does not mean a normal or mundane force. It refers to statistical normalization, in which you adjust values that are measured in different scales to a common scale. The way my monkey brain understands it, it's similar to finding the lowest common denominator between fractions. So this normalized crucible current is the common factor that binds all facets of this mysterious force. This enigmatic force is also closely associated or even synonymous with reddish gold, most prominently featured in the weapons and armor of the Crucible Knights who once served Lord Godfrey, and, as we discussed in part 1, the sap that spills out of the Shadow Tree. This is important to note because gold, being emblematic of the Golden Order, is often portrayed as at odds with the Crucible, but that is not truly the case. It's important to note here that, in my understanding, the Crucible is intrinsically linked to the Elden Ring. In an early interview, Miyazaki stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the Lands Between is blessed with the Elden Ring, and the Elden Ring is represented by the Erdtree. Well, if the Crucible is the primordial form of the Erdtree, and the Erdtree is a representation of the Elden Ring, then A equals B and B equals C. The Crucible and the Elden Ring were, at least at one point, the same force. And I believe that's exactly what's represented in Farum Azula. Of course, let's take this a step farther. because since we know that the Elden Ring was introduced to the Lands Between by a golden star, and that its original form is the Elden Beast, we can draw a line between the Crucible and the Elden Beast as well. To be honest, this is something that I should have brought up in part 1. Crucible Knight's Celeria's Spear gives us perhaps the most direct information on the Crucible. It reiterates that the primordial form of the Erdtree is close in nature to life itself, and that the spear is modeled on its crucible, with the lowercase c, interestingly. Its weapon art even releases a spiral torrent of energy. And in one of the most frustratingly obtuse descriptions found in the DLC, the incantation Divine Bird Feathers tells us that the Divine Bird Warriors, and indeed this technique, are said to bear resemblance to the Golden Crucible. What? We'll come back to this later. Given all these descriptions, I believe it's reasonable to say that the Crucible is the fountain from which all life originally sprung forth, and it's the driving force behind evolution in this setting. So that was a brief summary of what the game tells us for the most part regarding the Crucible on its own, but in the next section we'll see that the Crucible exists in anything but a vacuum. The roots of the Erdtree permeate the entirety of the Lands Between, and in much of the same way, the tendrils of the primordial crucible creep through nearly every belief system. The Outer Gods are arguably one of the most interesting aspects of Elden Ring's cosmology, since their influence is so apparent, yet they remain incredibly mysterious, never fully present, but always lurking around every corner. I won't go that deep into the Outer Gods, since that's been done by many other people before, including myself. But I'll just state that I do not believe the Outer Gods are alien entities originating from outer space, but rather that they are native to the Lands Between, and they became malignant entities once the natural order of the world was tampered with. I believe this to be the case because the mediums that the Outer Gods inhabit all seem to be fundamental aspects of nature and life itself. One final note, I do not believe that the Greater Will is a deity on the same level as the Outer Gods, as I still hold my belief that I expressed in my video about Ymir, that the Greater Will is the personification of the cosmos itself. Out of the deities that are generally thought of as Outer Gods, only a few are explicitly named as such. We have the Formless Mother, the Outer God of Rot, and the Outer God of the Twin Bird, which the community calls the Outer God of Death. The Formless Mother has explicit ties to the Crucible, for she is essentially the goddess of blood, a fundamental component of living things. And side note, I'm using the term blood literally here to refer to any liquid substance that distributes nutrients within an organism, be it literal blood or hemolymph in insects or the xylem, phloem in plants, just to name a few. And the Mother of Truth, as she's also called, is particularly attracted to cursed blood, which most commonly is found within the omens, but also the horn-sent curse blades. Both of these creatures are notable for their curling, twisting horns. Even the red albinarics found in Mogwin Dynasty, who are saturated with blood, are growing small curled horns atop their heads, which, as we just discussed, are markers of the Crucible. The Outer God of Rot's connection is not quite as explicit, but it's still an easy link to make. Rot and decay is another important aspect of any living ecosystem, one that can grow out of control and become malignant if the ecosystem is imbalanced. In the ruins of Rau, a place where the Crucible retains a great deal of influence, we have the Church of the Bud and its caretaker, Romina. Now, in my video about Romina, I came to a different conclusion regarding the Bud than I will relay here, but hey, opinions can change, baby. Go watch that for an alternate take, but I think now I align with most people in my belief that the Church of the Bud is related to a pre-Scarlet version of Rot. The statue depicting the bud that sits atop the church is strikingly similar to Melina's scarlet Aeonia bloom, as well as the bloom seen on the gnarled tree growing out of the swamp of Aeonia. Speaking of the Aeonia tree, it seems to be growing in a spiral pattern, no? But it doesn't end there, for as we can see in the Crucible Bloom incantation, Miranda flowers are aspects of the Crucible, and they release clouds of poison. Poison itself and poison incantations exclusively fall under the Servants of Rot's school of magic, so there appears to be an indisputable link between the outer god of Rot and the Crucible. The outer god of Death's connection admittedly lies wholly on deductive reasoning. Really, almost any conclusions we can make regarding the outer god of Death is deeply speculative, since there's only one reference to it in the entire game, that being the twin bird kite shield. And even with this item, we need to make a logical step to arrive at this conclusion. In fantasy media at large, life and death are portrayed as opposing forces, but in reality, when we're talking about the macro concept of life, the concept referenced in the description of Celeria's tree, death is an undeniable part of the system. This idea is even referenced in-game by the aforementioned poison incantations, as well as my favorite item description, the remembrance of the regal ancestor. Life sprouts from death as it does from birth. Such is the way of the living. And so it follows that if the primordial crucible includes all facets of life, the outer god of death would have been a part of this equation as well. Now, there are other entities that most people assume are outer gods, but aren't explicitly said to be so. The Frenzied Flame is so close to being confirmed an outer god. The description of Miquella's needle states that it can ward away the influence of an outer god, and it's the only item that is able to remove its influence from us. Being the embodiment of chaos, its current goal is to destroy the world of total order. But perhaps in an era before Marika tampered with the source code, as Quelaag puts it, it's not so malicious. The aspects of the Crucible, exemplified by the curling, twisting horns, are chaotic in nature, and the chaos of random mutations across generations is the driving force behind biology's ability to adapt to changing environments. Life is chaotic, evolution is chaotic. I don't know, this just makes sense to me. There's the Blood Star, and it's associated with the Thorn Sorceries and Thorn Sorcerers, of which I talked about quite a bit in part 1. This one might not be an outer god at all, or it might be one of the other outer gods under a different name. But I only mention it because it does have an explicit connection to the Crucible, and that is, of course, the incantation Crucible Thorns. The last potential outer god I want to talk about is the deity of the fire giants, the Fell God. This is where things get pretty interesting. It's said that Queen Marika slew the Fell God herself, but this is clearly untrue because we face the Fell God when it manifests in the last fire giant, therefore proving that we can't even rely on the item descriptions to be completely trustworthy. Thanks, FromSoft. And it's also said to live within the flaming orbs produced by the incantation Flame of the Fell God. It is essentially the god of fire, and it doesn't appear to have many connections to our topic because, fire isn't really a part of the circle of life. And before you chime in, no, the titles Fell Omen and Fell Curse are not related to the Fell God in the original Japanese language. However, if we look elsewhere, connections between the Fell God and the Crucible become realized. Just as I stated, the incantation Flame of the Fell God states it is said to be inhabited by a Fell God. And this description is also what tells us that the Fell God lives within the fire giants. The ball of flame produced by this incantation resembles a star, or more specifically, the sun. And this brings to mind the Dung Eater's armor, which is adorned with a heavy, sun-shaped medallion. It states that this medallion represents the guidance that he once saw, as well as the ring to which it will one day lead. This has to be a reference to the mending rune of the Fell Curse, which kinda looks like the sun, if the corona were made of horns and the photosphere could induce trypophobia. In the DLC, we're introduced to the Lamenters, the cursed offshoot of the Hornsent who are overgrown with gnarled thorns, and on close inspection, the face of the fell god is on its back. And when we transform into a Lamenter using the mask, we erupt in a shower of black flame. This has to mean that the fell god is not only related to the Crucible via the Hornsent traditions, but is almost certainly the true identity of the Glowmite Queen.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Okay, I'm kidding about that last part. But the connection between the fell god and the Crucible is growing more and more apparent, isn't it? And to put a nice bow around it, we have the furnace visage that is dropped by the towering furnace golems. It's explicitly stated to be in the image of the fell god of fire and that it's adorned with curling horns. So it seems abundantly clear that even though the linguistic connection between the fell god and the fell omen and the fell curse is shaky, there is an established connection between all of them through the primordial crucible. But fire, unlike everything else we talked about in the other outer gods, is still not an aspect of life or anything found on the life forms that inherit aspects of the crucible. Fire burns, it destroys, it reduces organic life to ash, yet it is an important component of a real-life crucible, that is, a melting pot where things are blended together with heat. So perhaps the flames of the fell god are the fire needed to energize the process. I was thinking about this missing link that blends fire and the primordial crucible when I recalled the divine bird feathers. The technique is supposed to resemble the golden crucible, and it kinda looks like rays of light, especially in the icon. And then it hit me like a sack of bricks, a melting pot containing the building blocks of life, energized by fiery combustion, emitting rays of golden light? Could the crucible be the sun? Well, I should have asked if the Crucible could have previously been the sun, because now, in my belief, the Crucible is the Shadow Tree. But when this conclusion came to me, it felt so obvious, I couldn't believe I didn't see it before. The most obvious clue from day one of the game are the sunflowers, which all face the Erdtree. Even the Shadow Tree has its own sunflower variant, and its avatar has a sunflower for a head. It's not really a novel idea that the Erdtree contains the power of the sun, or that it takes the role of the sun in the lands between. So why not also the Crucible, the primordial form of the Erdtree? But let's go through it together for those who are unaware. The Warming Stone tells us that the Erdtree was once as warm as the gentle sun. Its ingredients are an erdleaf flower, smoldering butterfly, and a sanctuary stone. In other words, a flower deriving from the Erdtree, the source of life, a stone from Farum Azula, notably bathed in continual sunlight, and a source of fire. It is relevant that the Warming Stones are created using an incantation of the 2 fingers. On the other hand, in the DLC, we can craft sun warmth stones. So explicit! These are crafted from blessed bone shards, black pyreflies, and spirit gravestones. A bone blessed with the gold of the Shadow Tree, a stone of spiritual nature, and another fire source. And even more interestingly, these sun warmth stones are blessed with an Erdtree incantation, and not just any Erdtree incantation, an ancient Erdtree incantation, the same school of magic from which the Crucible incantations are derived. This adds even more weight to my theory that the Shadow Tree is what's left of the Crucible in the modern era, for we don't need the faith distributed by the 2 fingers to create a sun warmth stone, but the pure gold that originates with the Crucible. These healing stones are tiny simulacra of the sun. In part 1, I stated that the Omen Curse is a result of the restrained shadow of the Erdtree lashing out against its persona, like steam bursting through the seams of a pressurized container. But it doesn't end there. The Dung Eater's mending rune of the Fell Curse is the culmination of all the hatred and disdain that the shadow has for the Golden Order. And to quote the Dung Eater's armor, the heavy, sun-shaped medallion represents the guidance he once saw. Since we're back on the topic of Fel things, I just want to throw in here my theory that the Fel God is the fire of the sun, in my interpretation. It's the first piece of the Crucible that was cast aside by Marika when she created the Erdtree. This explains why the Fel God is described as one of the Erdtree's greatest enemies, and why Marika went to such great lengths to contain it. It's purely speculative, but there you have it. Now, let's return to the spiral, the normalized crucible current that the Hornsent just couldn't stop salivating over. Now, I don't really like using real-life history or science to completely justify my lore theories, since we are talking about a fantasy world with magic and other mystical qualities, but check this out. The spiral of the Crucible was likely inspired by the Fibonacci sequence as well as the Golden Spiral, which is more just an interesting observation and not really related to the sun itself, but it is related to how plants have evolved to most efficiently capture the energy of the sun, with the most famous example being, of course, sunflowers. And it doesn't end there, for in my research I learned something that blew my mind, and it completely solidified this theory for me. So, the sun rotates, right? And the entire solar system orbits around the galactic center, right? Well, as it rotates and it moves through space, the sun's magnetosphere interacts with the solar wind it creates, and through that creates the heliospheric current sheet, forming a spiral out of the interplanetary matter. The sun literally bathes the entire solar system in a spiral current of solar energy. How cool is that? Obviously, I have no way of knowing if this was the inspiration behind the spiral imagery that represents this normalized crucible current, but it's just a beautiful synergy between real life and what we see in the game. And in real life, the sun was an absolutely essential part of the process for life forming on our planet. And some would argue that macroorganisms could have never evolved without the sun's influence. Its radiation was likely an early catalyst of mutations that enabled biodiversity, and its light is necessary for photosynthetic organisms that serve as the bedrock for the food chain that nearly all other forms of life are built on. The sun could artistically be described as gold with a red tinge. I mean, if there's anything in real life that could be described in a similar way to the primordial crucible, it's the sun. Now, I do understand why people are hesitant to place this capstone on their ideas. Since the Crucible Knight Celeria's weapon is modeled after the Crucible of Life, this suggests that the original form of the Crucible was in the shape of a tree, and returning to the blight that is the Divine Bird Feathers description, it also states that the Divine Bird Warriors themselves resemble the Golden Crucible. So, is it the sun, a tree, or a bird person? Another common interpretation regarding the sun is that it's associated with death, given that those who live in death are the only people who bear the Sunrealm Shield, an item that speaks about an ancient civilization known as the Seat of the Sun, as well as Miquella's attempts at Castle Sol to eclipse the sun to revive a soulless demigod. So, in the final chapter, I want to address some of these theories. First, I want to address the bird person allegations. To be honest, I'm not sure what to make of this connection if it's meant to be literal. However, it only takes a quick Google search for sun gods as birds to quickly see how many cultures throughout history and our world associate the sun with birds, with the Egyptian god Ra as a very famous example. So I'm interpreting this as being imagery to evoke these real world religions, but let me know if you have other ideas on what this can mean. And we do get to play as an actual bird warrior in Elden Ring Night Rain, so maybe there's more to this idea than it appears. Most of the information that directly references the sun is related to Castle Sol. The Eclipse Shoutout and the Eclipse Crest Shield reference a sun that is both eclipsed and drained of color. The ghost found in the chapel calls it Frigid Sun of Soul and says, "Surrender to the eclipse, grant life to the soulless bones." The ghost atop the castle laments that the sun has not been swallowed. I think that some people are misunderstanding what this information is trying to convey. Lots of people have been saying that the sun was eclipsed, and that's why it's drained of color and lacks warmth. While the Shoutout and shield could be understood as depicting an eclipse draining the sun of warmth and color, I'm not so sure. Seems clear to me that an eclipse hasn't happened yet. The ghost on the tower explicitly says that the ritual has failed, that the sun has not been swallowed, and the ghost in the chapel calls it the frigid sun of soul. So again, implying that the sun already lacks its heat. And yes, this does seem to be an attempt by Miquella to resurrect Godwyn, so I'm not denying that. I'm just saying I don't see any reason to believe that the sun is intrinsically linked to death on its own. Rather, that they were attempting to act upon a sun that was already sapped of its vital energy. Well, what sapped the sun of its vital energy? Here I place the blame on the greater will. Similar to what fellow YouTubers Silent Ellipses and Alchemist have touched on, I do think that the golden star spoken of in the Elden Star's description was the essence of the sun brought to the lands between, though I don't think it happened in the way that they theorize. And as for the Crucible originally being in the shape of a tree, well, I almost hate to do it, but I'm gonna have to save that for part 3. I know. I'm terrible, but I'm not doing this for engagement purposes. I've just written and rewritten this next part numerous times, and it keeps spiraling off in so many directions that I think this question, along with a few others, deserve its own video. And it's getting away from the main thesis of this video, that the Crucible is the essence of the sun. But for a little teaser, I will say, I do think that there was another divine tree. Several, in fact, which I want to talk about, but one in particular that was another prior form of the Erdtree. One that was likely ruled over in the time of Metyr before the Greater Will took matters into its own hands. So my sincerest thanks if you've made it through this video. Let me know what you think about my conclusions. Do you think the Crucible was the sun? Follow me on Blue Sky to see my artwork, leave a like, maybe even subscribe if you enjoyed this and want to hear the next part. I've linked the videos and posts that help me formulate my theory in the description, so check them out too. And until next time, I hope that your bodies will stack together and form a spiral column that may one day reach the gods.